Hello and welcome back to this second paper of our sessions this morning at the 2023 Barth Conference. It's good to see you all in this room, and welcome to all those of you that are joining us online. I'm very excited about this next paper, and it's first I'll say my name is Cambria Kaltwasser of Northwestern College in Iowa. And I have the privilege of introducing our next speaker. Dr. Hanna Reichel is Associate Professor of Reformed Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, having previously taught at universities in Heidelberg and Halle, Wittenberg. They are the author of a book that might be of particular interest to this audience that's forthcoming on political theologies of omniscience. And Dr. Reichel's first respondent will be Dr. Natalia Marandu. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Hanna Reichel.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. And I love that at this glorious conference, I also get a chance to contribute or test some ideas and look forward yes, maybe we can contest them together. It matters, writes Donna Haraway in her Interspecies Manifesto. It matters, staying with the trouble. That's the title of the book. It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots knock knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. I'm intrigued by the sentiment which seems to entangle a profound materialism, but also hint at something like a return to an idealism. If Marx famously quipped against Feuerbach, the philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world differently. The point is to change it. It seems that more and more people and movements in our time are reaching the opposite or converse conclusion. If we are to change the world, we need other ways to think it. Change does not come from what is, but from the ability to imagine another world, a new world. We heard that terminology before at this conference. So this sentiment, which to me seems to be pretty widespread in a variety of critical reflection today, strikes me almost as an anonymous form of theological realism. But be that as it may, if it matters, what matters we used to think other matters with, how do we conceptualize the political? If in its most foundational, its most basic function, the political has to do with structuring and navigating difference, how do we imagine the distinctions that structure the political space? That's the question I'm diving into. And to this date, probably the dominant model to do so is Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction. We said we were not going to talk about Schmitt. Of course, we're also going to talk about Schmitt. I will treat him only very briefly in order to ask what alternatives are possible, and I will look for such alternatives in the theology of Karl Barth. I will claim that he provides not only one, but at least three alternative models of mapping the political space. Note that what I am reconstructing here as distinct conceptual models are overlapping strands of thought in Barth. I'm not interested in arguing that any one of them represents true authorial intent or the internal logic of Barth's system more accurately than any other, nor am I making claims about their genealogical relation to one another. I'm trying to extrapolate them as conceptual models to assess their mechanics, their schematics in a somewhat abstract form, and to assess their heuristic and constructive value for conceptualizing the space of the political theologically. So I'm trying to mine Barth's dogmatics for what we might call, with Nimi Mariboko, theological theory. Carl Schmitt's famous definition of the political is that of the most intense and extreme antagonism, which categorically distinguishes friend from enemy and pits collectives publicly against one another in antagonism and in what Schmitt calls the extreme case in war. But of course, the real possibility of the extreme case also structures the normality of the everyday, similar to how the state of exception funds the state of law in Schmitt's legal theory. Schmitt does not come up with this framework out of thin air. He draws on a long trajectory of political thought that may be traced back through thinkers as diverse as Hegel and Hobbes and Heraclitus, and which sees some form of conflict of us versus them, in group versus out group, and ultimately war as the underlying state of human existence, which kind of opens up the Cartesian plane of political space. And that makes politics necessary and possible, as, so to speak, the continuation of war by other means. Schmitt is very clear that there's no essential property that marks this boundary between friend and enemy, but as a foundational structure, the antagonism that otherizes some as enemies, thus also allowing others to be recognizable as friends, and that this fundamental structure constitutes the political space both at extra and at intra is a given for him. The issues with such an inherently otherizing conception of the political are obvious, not only theoretically, but also in the well-documented empirical manifestations. Tribalism, nationalism, xenophobia, militarism are part of its DNA, as well as the otherization of minority groups within as outsiders and enemies of society. Think of the terrorist, the antisocial queer, and so forth. Some will always be on the receiving end of the violent exclusion that marks this political space. Schmitt's foundational distinction obviously, sadly, has a lot of descriptive and explanatory power, but is a different mapping of the political space possible, or are pragmatism and refusal our only options here? We turn to Barth. Like Schmitt, an anti-liberal, although that's contested, of course, like Schmitt, a thinker of sovereignty and a zealot of the absolute, as Jakob Taubes called the two of them. In the litmus test of their time, that was National Socialism, Barth and Schmitt came out on different sides. The one's political theory of sovereignty endorsing the dictatorship of the Führer as God ordained and necessary, while the other one's theological theory of sovereignty denounced it as pure idolatry against the first commandment, you shall have no other gods. Their theories of sovereignty have been widely compared, and there are people in this room who have done some of that work. So I have no intention of rehashing that. Of course, there are other differences, not just theoretical differences. They also have different national backgrounds, different denominational backgrounds, and so forth. All of that will also filter into some of it. But at least it might also be of interest to look at the difference in the foundational distinction that they draw. Because, again, this is a similarity that they have. A foundational distinction does structure both of their thought at the most basic ontological level. If for Schmitt, the distinction is the horizontal one between friend and enemy, for Barth, the distinction is a vertical one. Not the alterity of the stranger, but the divine totaliter aliter. If I have a system, Barth famously writes at the outset of the Römer Brief commentary, if I have a system, it is limited to a recognition of what Kierkegaard called the infinite qualitative distinction between time and eternity, and to my regarding this as possessing negative as well as positive significance. God is in heaven, and thou art on earth. So we might ask, what difference does God make? Or rather, what difference does the indelible distinction between God and what is not God make for the constitutive distinctions, the foundational otherizations that mark our political space so profoundly? Barth's distinction is as radical as Schmitt's, and we might interpret it as introducing a similarly categorical antagonism in the vertical that Schmitt introduces in the horizontal. And it has, as Barth says, both negative and positive significance. How so? The infinite qualitative distinction between heaven and earth radically disrupts and reorients all human doing, both in relation to God and in relation to one another. It's, quote, and these quotes are from the Roma Brief, its radical dissolution of all physical, intellectual, and spiritual achievements of men effects an all embracing relativization of all human distinctions. As it contests any human merits, whether argued on the basis of religion, culture, education, class, or race, it also makes impossible any claims to superiority on the basis of any of these factors, and thus contests any hierarchical structure of the political space. The ideological critique that can be built on such a conception has often been noted. It rests upon the rejection of any correlation for that human divine relation in the created realm. So the insistence on this infinite qualitative distinction allows Barth to contest any cooptation of God for political aims and funds his outspoken critique against National Socialism, but also against, as we've seen, revolutionary movements, as we've discussed at length yesterday. In relation to this holy other, all humans find themselves strangely united, if not necessarily reconciled. Human community now appears grounded upon a negative, as Barth says in Romans. So the distinction to this holy other and this holy other's judgment upon all of humanity funds a kind of negative universal fellowship that no positive commonality could ever guarantee without ostracizing others. Furthermore, the shared relation to the holy other places humans positively, if indirectly, in universal fellowship with each other. Indeed, one might argue that the dialectics of God's negative alterity as the holy other funds Barth's unspoken universalism as much as later on in his work, God's positive alterity as the concrete other in the incarnation, which will explicitly lead him to argue for universal human rights, not necessarily very early on, but in a time when such was at least not the theological mainstream position. As I've argued elsewhere, if we believe that antagonism is somehow structurally irreducible to being human, then in this theological model, it is God who bears the burden of it, right? Who bears the burden of our otherizing tendencies. Not only is God, and this shows we can kind of trace from the totaliter aliter into the theology of atonement in Church Dogmatics 4:1. God is the holy other in creation, revelation, and judgment. Therefore, God kind of extends a certain antagonism against humankind. This is the famous no, right? But in the incarnation, God also enters the fabric of human antagonisms and becomes the concrete other, otherized for us onto the cross. Once more, strangely uniting humanity negatively in their rejection of this God. Right? So this model does not only work in the early Romans commentary, but kind of can be seen working through his doctrine of reconciliation. The judge in our stead in my inflection becomes the holy otherized for us. So this alterity not only affects judgment, the no, but also reconciliation, the yes, for the human being. How to evaluate this model has often been debated. At its best, the infinite qualitative distinction between God and not God is to be regarded fundamentally as a radical theology of political ideology critique, or at least as an a or anti-political theology in Eric Peterson's sense, so one that resists the legitimation of any political system of domination or even hierarchy. So Barth's insistence on God as the holy other served famously as a stance of resistance to warmongering, to nationalism, and afforded tools for ideology critique also in the so-called church struggle, where God's absolute distinction from the various human claims to power served to theologically deflate and refuse the ultimate claim to authority of the Nazi ideology. The totaliter came with a theological anthropology that is often perceived as overly negative, right? Since it basically interprets the God-human difference, the epistemological distance from human minds to divine things, and the possibility of ethics as such, interprets all of that radically hamartiologically, right? It's marked by sin. The infinite qualitative distinction between God and the human being always puts the human being in an untenable position of double binds and self-entanglement from which we cannot free ourselves. So those who share an interest in ideology critique will find much to celebrate in this line of thought, while those who are desperately looking for positive ground to fund political movements and advocacy will likely find themselves betrayed and disappointed if they put their trust in Barth, as many of his contemporaries have experienced, and as we also saw surfacing in the debates around Tambach yesterday between Brandy Daniels and Gary Dorian's readings. In any case, we see that the foundational antagonism that structures Schmidt's conception remains deeply baked into this model, right? The price of overcoming its effects in the horizontal seems to be their reification in the vertical plane, including the violence that attends it, as we see at the cross. So this might strike us as an ingenious or simply realistic solution, or alternatively also as quite unsatisfying, and all the critiques that have traditionally been voiced against theologies of redemptive suffering, as well as theologies of sovereignty, apply. Are there no other options? There's a second model in Barth. If the first conceptualized the foundational difference as one of alterity, manifesting an antagonistic judgment and authorization, the second one conceptualizes the foundational difference as covenantal relationship. And we've already heard a lot of that from Natalia Morandiuk earlier today. What in the first model was expressly forbidden, to establish any correspondence for the ultimate distinction in the created realm, now becomes the motor of creation and its history, as well as its internal structure. Of course, even his earliest invocations of the holy other were never in Barth's mind about generic or abstract alterity, but always about the God who revealed God's self in this concrete other, human Jesus Christ. But Barth's early Christology was somewhat mathematical, right? It's all full of circles and points and tangents. And as he fleshes it out in Church Dogmatics 3, which we also started discussing earlier today, more and more different differences kind of get added into the picture to the point that it is worth treating it as another model. Primary here is the eternal inner Trinitarian covenantal relationship, right? So the the first and foundational distinction is here not the one between God and the world, but the I-thou relation between God the Father and God the Son. This primary relationship constitutes the condition of possibility and harbors the template for the relation of God to creation, such that covenant is the internal foundation of creation and creation is the external foundation of the covenant, which then plays out in history. The analogy, note that word, Barth uses it, the analogy between God and human being is simply the existence and relation of the I to the thou. This relationship is firstly constitutive for God. It then is also constitutive for the human created by God. Abstracting from this constitutive vis-a-vis, one would abstract both that which makes God divine and that which makes the human being human. The bridge between the inner divine covenantal relationship and the covenant between God and creation is Christological, of course. And the two natures Christology even presents yet another iteration of the covenantal ontology. So the foundational relationality to the other constitutes both Christ's divinity, as he's the God who elects to be with and for God's people, and Christ's humanity, as he's the true human being who lives with God as God's covenantal partner. And in the incarnation, this fourness radiates in relation to fellow humans. Christ becomes other humans' merciful neighbor, and thus also their savior, an ontological relation which manifests itself in words, deeds, and habitus in his whole story or history. Geschichte is an ambiguous term, obviously, in German. And we've heard more about this already this morning. So if we can sum up, quote here, the divinity of the human Jesus in the sentence, he is the human being for God, then we can equally simply and definitively say about his humanity that he's the human being for the human being, for the fellow human and fellow humans in co-humanity to each one and to all of them. Each one and all of them. Humanity is not an independent nature that exists then to be concretized in co-humanity. Rather, true humanity is the relation that Christ models, which then becomes definitive of humanity as such. Humanity, Barth goes on to say, is co-humanity. Subsequently defining, quote, our humanity as such and in general, minimally this way, it is the human beings being in the encounter, and in this sense, the human being's determination for being together with the other human being. So far, so good, apart from the somewhat reductionistic dyadic structure of any and all relations that we might discuss in a different time and place. We might now expect that true humanity, like Christ's, asserts itself in co-humanity in ongoing relations of encounter and mutual openness, as Barth says. If Christ's earthly ministry is any indication, such co-humanity might manifest in relations of fellowship, service, healing, forgiveness, and so forth. So put schematically, we might expect the ensuing model of human relationality to look something like this, right? Humans in relations of encounter and mutual openness. But this is not what we get. We already heard this earlier, at least not at this point in the church dogmatics. And the difference that was already pointed out between the different volumes of three will come into play in a moment. But so at this point in the argument, something quite odd happens without any direct motivation in the divine human relationship or in Christology. Barth now stipulates that our constitutive relational co-humanity consists in its original, quote, and most, quote, in its original and most concrete form in this distinction in relationship of man to woman, of woman to man. So even as Barth, and in this place still, continues to declare, quote, a creation and existence of the human being in groups and kinds, in races and nations, to be completely out of the question. Those are his words. He at the same time concludes that the human being cannot be fully human without accepting its identity as foundationally constituted in relation to a gendered and sexed, as well as hierarchically ordered other. And so schematically, we get this, right? The inconsistency of this move within Barth's broader Christological and Trinitarian commitments have been noted. I point you back to Faye Bodley D'Angelo's already mentioned book and to Natalia's earlier lecture. I will not rehash these arguments here. I'm also less interested in saying this is an inconsistency. I think what happens is that Barth had actually started to conceptualize the divine human difference in other than antagonistic terms, and might thus also have mapped the political space of interhuman differences in other than antagonistic terms. But somehow, and I'm interested in the somehow, he reintroduces the infinite qualitative distinction from the previous model, in which we remember there could be no correspondence for that distinction, into this one, where now our co-humanity, our being for others as modeled in Christ's humanity, can only consist in this man-woman relationship, and so forth. Please don't freak out immediately, at least not immediately. If when I claim that this effect, the somehow, can be elucidated with a piece of queer theory, a notion that Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick calls homosociality. So, short excursus for those who didn't study this this morning. Sedgwick famously postulated that to understand the sex-gender system, it is not sufficient to focus on the supposedly binary relationship between the sexes, right? It seems like these are binary genders, and there's a kind of a heteronormativity going on. But in order to explain that, we actually need to look at the homosocial bonds. That is, the relationships between members of the same sex, which can range from intense bonding and camaraderie to rivalry and competition, and that these are deeply significant for the engendering and upholding of binary gender and compulsory cis heterosexuality. In this analysis, in order to constitute oneself as a man, because of course, man is always the subject of self constitution, in order to do that, one needs recognition by other men, recognition as being like them in some fundamental sense. So men thus need to identify with one another, and they need to desire one another's recognition, but they must be careful at all costs to avoid the impression of desiring one another. That would be kind of gay, right? So a direct desire for the other would cross the line between homosociality and homosexuality. And homosexuality, under the conditions of hegemonic masculinity, leads to emasculation, right? Rather than to establishing one's masculinity. So it results in the loss of what one aspired to in the first place. That is the tenuous line that one now has to walk. So in the struggle for recognition between men, that's the title of Sedgwick's book, women become a necessary third. There is what she calls a heterosexual detour of homosocial desire, in which women become objects of prestige, conquest, and rivalry, among other things. But the subsequent cis heterosexual relationships operate not as ends in themselves, but as conduits of a relationship in homosocial bonds, right? As men aspire to establish themselves as subjects in relation to other men. So women as a third will thus remain subordinated to and in the homosocial bond. And this subordination is what establishes man as a subject, whether on equal footing or in hierarchical ordering, to other men. And homosociality may appear in forms of friendship, bromance, brotherhood, but there's an underlying struggle for recognition here that remains, in Sedgwick's words, one of extreme, compulsory, and intensely volatile mastery and subordination. So homosociality in this analysis sustains a hegemonic form of masculinity and patriarchal power through this dual mechanism of homosexual panic and subordination of women. So this is now my claim. Through Sedgwick's lens of homosociality, Barth's double dichotomy between God and human and between man and woman appears in a new light as a triangular relationship that achieves the recognition of man as fully human in the God-human relationship at the cost of subordinating woman. Let's watch this in slow motion. First, we have the duplication of the covenantal relationship, right? We said the primary relational constitution is within God. And then in correlation to it, there's Christ's co-humanity to other human beings. Neither of these are antagonistic. But we also still have this infinite qualitative distinction thing, which is to some extent. But then, of course, and this is the trick, right? Christ is true God and true human in one person. And in his person, these two planes are reconciled. They don't exist in two different planes. They're united here. So maybe we should put it like this. Christ's double divine and creaturely co-relationality are held together in Christ's hypostatic union. But the infinite qualitative distinction between God and the human being that is not God still exists and leads to the co-humanity with Christ exercising an impossible demand on the human being. The desire for establishing oneself in the relationship with God manifests in a complex interplay of competition and mutual imitation. God becoming human, the human becoming Christ-like, as moves that establish brotherhood, equality, camaraderie, fellowship, solidarity. Of course, achieving direct equality or even aspiring to it, as direct equality with God, is theologically prohibited, right? It's a misdirected desire. It is sin. It is hubris. But even actively wanting to be human like Jesus becomes problematic. Theologically, of course, true humanity can never be achieved by the human being. Just like masculinity, it is an aspirational category. And just like masculinity, it can only be pursued indirectly without performatively disqualifying itself, right? So even as the human being must strive to be godly and to be Christ-like in some way, the human being also can only be truly human by recognizing that Christ is the only true human. So true humanity here functions like hegemonic masculinity. I'm not saying that they're the same thing. There's just a structural similarity, right? So the only possibility to achieve true humanity in this model is an indirect one. We cannot compete with Christ for true humanity directly. We can only reproduce the same relationship in which Christ stands to us to establish ourselves as equal in some way. Therefore, like our humanity is ordered in a binary relationship of obedience to God, we must establish ourselves as similarly commanding the obedience of another. Voila, the B follows A logic. So the lens of homosociality can explain what otherwise remains theologically inexplicable. That in Barth's theology, the mediation of the holy other in Christ as the concrete other does not effect the overcoming of all interhuman antagonisms after all. Instead, the subordination that constitutively marks the God-human relationship is outsourced to a part of humanity, woman, in this way elevating man to right relationship with God, which is articulated in equivalence and co-humanity with Christ. So the interhuman relationship needs to be as hierarchically ordered as the God-human relationship, because this hierarchical form is the only thing that makes man competitive with Christ while at the same time obeying the imperative to recognize the ultimate divine supremacy. It is by mirroring the God-human hierarchy, a hierarchically ordered relationship within which man, because of course the theologian is always male, is able to both recognize the ultimate primacy of Christ as alpha human, so to speak, and establish himself as a partner in a homosocial relationship with God or Christ. In a homosocial dynamic, even for the loser, competition leads to a participation in a game of male power and thus, quote, provides a stage for establishing self both as an individual and as appropriately masculine, this is in the quote here, human, both allowing the perpetuation of male or here divine dominance to human man's self-conceptualization as positively human. So analyzed through a lens of homosociality, those problematic elements in Barth's text that seemed otherwise inexplicably or at least unnecessary now appear quite consistent. The insistence on humanity's constitutive subdivision into man and woman and the subsequent patriarchal, sexist, and homophobic stances. The reification of compulsory cis heterosexuality as the necessary form of true humanity, in which Barth repeatedly comes really close to declaring homosexuals, gender nonconforming people, and even feminists and asexual, celibate, or unmarried people as effectively less than human. And additionally, so these are some of the problematic. I find them problematic. You may or may not agree. And there's also an implicit gendering and sexing of the God-human difference that I assume even Barth himself would have been quite uncomfortable with. But if previous speakers and writers have picked up on the inconsistency of some of this with other commitments in Barth's theology, if there's an inconsistency here, it may be because Barth has actually, in the meantime, started working on a different model. So just to briefly rehash, right, if the first was based on this divine totaliter aliter and then ran into the atonement theology of the otherwise for us, In the second model, we have this covenantal relationship that mediates divine relationality into a corresponding human relationality. The third model also appears in Church Dogmatics 3:4, and in the same section, actually, freedom and fellowship or freedom and community. I don't know which way it's translated. You will know better. So it's the same section where Barth talks about man and woman, and then parents and children. And in this section, Barth then poses the question whether any other distinctions that structure our political space can claim a status in a theologically constituted political ontology. So, right, he's inquiring whether notions such as folk or nation carry any theological weight. And he responds, as is his custom, with a resounding no. Instead, he here argues that our co-humanity always gets negotiated with the immediate neighbor and moves outwards from the near to the far, all the way to the horizon of universal humanity. And while it appears like these are in the paragraph kind of concentric circles, um, I think we have an overlap of these different models going on here. So the logic according to which Barth argues here, to me, seems to be grounded in his doctrine of election. And the negation of difference and solidarity is based on the kenotic movement of Christ, of which you already also heard more this morning earlier. In election, God determines God's self to be God with and for God's people. This decision is not based on any quality inherent in the other. And it's also not based on any relation of equality, complementarity, or antagonism. In fact, there's nothing that requires it, and it has no preconditions at all. It simply ensues by virtue of God's decision. But it results in a self-determination that performs this outward movement, which is space-making for others. This movement is that of the son going into the far country, which marks at once the son's humiliation, while at the same time bringing the far country into God's own vicinity. Right? So the far country into which the son goes is that which by all criteria should be remote from God, but it means paradoxically that God is not present there. And we see this, so God becomes present in the far country of the created world as such, in the far country of the people of Israel that become God's own people, in the far country that is the life, suffering, and cross of Jesus, and eventually in the far country that is, by definition, remotest from God, hell. So, not based on any sameness or difference is such proximity established, but simply by virtue of God's self-determination and subsequent movement. We might call this movement kenotic, and this word has appeared already earlier. And I would just quickly want to clarify that kenotic here means not a technical way in which it's sometimes been used as like an exchange of properties, but in the sense gestured toward in Paul's Philippians hymn. As which might, I'm kind of slightly adapting the translation here, as the primary characteristic of such kenosis, I want to identify a not insisting on sameness, right? Not regarding equality as something to be held on. The son not insisting on sameness is what allows the son to move into the far country. And in Barth's conception of election as God's self-determination, we may thus even claim that God is essentially kenotic. This movement is who God determines God's self to be. Barth insists that the command of God does not meet a disembodied and abstract human being, that it rather addresses someone as someone who is, this is a quote, in precisely this relationship to this one close to them and those ones far from them. These concrete relationships matter. They are the concrete site in which each human being has to materialize their co-humanity. The fellow creatures to whom we find ourselves situated in degrees of nearness and farness, proximity and distance are now part of an ethical task. These relationships are important to who we are, yet always fluid. I'm using only words that Barth uses here. Fluid, in transition, reversible, thus factical, but always contingent, right? No entity, Barth argues here, between the closest horizon and the universal horizon of humanity may be artificially hypostasized, he says, as possessing ultimate meaning or theological legitimation. And Barth looks at differences between people as constituted by language, geographic space, cultural heritage, shared history, even questions of bloodlines. And Barth finds that in all these cases, they do indicate it's never easy to draw the exact boundary. There's something like a universal horizon, and then there are fluid boundaries that are to be negotiated rather than stark inner distinctions. So the space is structured only by Christ's co-humanity on the one side and the universal horizon of all of humanity on the other side. All relationships in between are mediated in active historical and intentional negotiation. Um, you may have noticed that I've cheated slightly, right? So Barth runs these concentric circles from Christ to man and woman, the nuclear family, and then denies any intermediary categories from there to the horizon of universal humanity. Um, but he does so. I think disentangling the models, it would be more consistent to think of Christ and then the ultimate horizon, such that family, tribe, race, or nation do not have a specific command of God. Such entities may exist de facto, of course, they are formed and reformed, negotiated, deconstructed, and reconstructed because in every location where we find ourselves, there are always neighbors, and some of them include our kin and our partners, right? But the proximity and distance can be named indexically. There's no fixed boundary that can be drawn between us and them. Or to put it differently, how we draw these boundaries is subject to negotiation, not a matter of divine command. Another asterisk here to my cheating. I've talked about humanity. There's actually no reason why the outer boundary should be that of humanity, as the boundary of a movement that pushes outwards and is about God, which is not God. Um, it should simply be the universal horizon of creation. And just like we will negotiate degrees of proximity and remoteness with fellow human creatures across lines of difference, so we will with fellow more than human creatures. So, in all the dynamics that such negotiation of local, neighborly co humanity might take, Barth ascertains that faithfulness to the command of God would put the human being into a movement. The movement, as such, he says, however, leads the human being unavoidably from the narrow into the wide space, from one's own people to those others who are also peoples. One's own people, then, whoever one sees them to be, can never be a wall, only a door. Whoever is really in a people among those near to them is by this very fact also always in transition toward those far from them to the other peoples. This movement resembles, I think, action first paradigms of solidarity. I don't have time to draw this out, but right, most theories of solidarity see solidarity as based on a shared identity marker or a shared experience, whether leveraging a commonality or shared adversity. And as is well known, either of these ways of defining or trying to base solidarity run into problems of essentialism and normativity. They also have necessary exclusions at extrum and prescriptions at intrum. So they have limits in the possibility of coalition building and rely on a need to fracture the social space as well. There's an alternative and ultimately performative model of grounding solidarity. Andrea Sangiovanni is a thinker that I want to cite here, where it says the postulate that is that shared action is what creates solidarity. There's no antecedent commonality, no shared interest or shared opposition that needs to that can be presupposed or should be presupposed. But solidarity is the effect, the outcome of joint action. And I think that is maybe similar to the way that election and kenosis works here, right? It's not insisting on sameness as a precondition, but seeing it as something that can ensue on the other side of moving into the proximity, of becoming neighbors. Right? I'm also thinking of the Good Samaritan here. It is something that one actively has to do in order for it to happen. But then on the other side of it, this movement opens up the space for a shared experience, a shared history, and potentially even a shared identity, right? We talk about it as in Christ, while at the same time relativizing the significance both of commonalities and of differences as strong theopolitical boundary markers. So we might call this work of election and kenosis, something like God's strategic de-essentialism, or a practice of kinship making by kinship doing. Our own co-humanity might then also be modeled on such kenotic action. Co-humanity would then not be an essential characteristic or anthropological quality, but a practice, an ethics of organizing and a political engendering of solidarity across difference. Um, of course, conjugal and parental relationships can continue to exist, just like peoples and nations and all kinds of groups may be formed, but they will not be theologically more privileged than other forms of human solidarity and sociality. They cannot be reified into theologically necessary structures, um, although they can become kinship in which we live. Um, I'm almost there. Just because I have kind of noted significant critiques of the previous two models, I do want to say there's nothing in this third model that inherently prevents also the formation of in-groups and out-groups and tribalism and all the other things. But it does say that the friend-enemy distinction is not necessary, right? It's not a necessary structure of a political space. It is just what happens when we neglect this work, this labor of solidarity. Um, a real downside of this model is that otherwise quite promising unconditionality and performativity also makes clear that this model cannot guarantee anything, right? Nothing is guaranteed here. Solidarity is possible beyond sameness or difference. That is hopeful. But whether it will be done, one cannot guarantee. Maybe in this sense, the model is profoundly realistic. I mean, I think we do actually witness that both sometimes real solidarity occurs, but if anything, it's maybe more the exception than the norm. And it's hard and ongoing work because only in the doing of it are relationships of neighborliness constituted. And how and to whom we choose to become neighbors is subject to all kinds of hermeneutics and can also stabilize as well as cross existent boundaries. In another sense, so it may be realistic. In another sense, this model strikes me as profoundly unrealistic, namely in the assumption of a sovereign subject that reaches out freely, right? This might be the case for God, but we're no such fully constituted subjects. We're not all that free. Maybe we should say, fortunately, we inhabit both the world and the earth, Dr. Carter, in a variety of real entanglements and interdependencies, Dr. Keller, many of which we remain acutely and problematically unaware of before we relate across difference and so forth. So let me say, I'm not trying to sell you any of these three models. Whether Barth's thought can be useful in how we navigate the challenges of being creatures in interrelation with other creatures, or whether, as Dr. Chaka suggested yesterday, we might also at times have to park Barth and develop other models, is also open for discussion. Um, But in relation to Schmidt's still dominant definition of the political in terms of antagonism, these models that I have developed out of layers and Barth's theology can show what difference God makes, as Ted Smith has recently asked, wherever he's sitting there now. Um, but they immediately also qualify such a claim by differentiating that how one conceptualizes God and the God world relationship, God might make different differences, and not all of them positive either. If it matters, which matters we used to think other matters with, it might be worth prying these models apart and investigating their mechanics. But still, the inherent idealism too might be subject to debate, as if we only needed to get the theology right and then everything else would follow. But theology, as I may or may not have recently argued in a book, will also not save us. So I look forward to this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hanna. Now we are going to invite Dr. Natalia Marandu back to respond to Dr. Reichel's paper.
So thank you, Dr. Reichel, for a wonderful portrayal of three distinct models for organizing and imagining the political. Um, I have three questions related to the three models. And I hope to frame these questions as springboards for conversation. rather than anything else. So, regarding the first model, um, according to which the holy other God, totality other, in the incarnation comes close to us in order to become um, the otherized other on our behalf, to overcome the otherization of other human others, as we are prone to treat others and be treated by others. So in this model, of course, there is a negative feature in the sense that we are constituted as human beings through a kind of negation, as you beautifully described. So perhaps this model has a limited function, if at all, and I appreciate the way in which you show that this can be deployed helpfully against nationalism and against other forms of human totalitarianism. So, while this is a limited model at best, is it nonetheless useful for us in our current geopolitical context? And if so, how? And perhaps in conversation with with what other partner model? Secondly, a very interesting proposal. I love it the way uh, this kind of diagnosis of why Barth's incongruency might be underneath it, rooted in a kind of a larger commitment that Barth has, which could be explained through a queer theory, a model of homosociality. Um, my question is, why is the competition necessary in homosociality? Is this the way homosociality is construed? Is it an empirical observation of humanity? Or what else? And what remains of this model if we subtract the competitive over againstness, while keeping perhaps a sociality that is pan-human rather than a homo variety? And then to what extent would this model be resembling or be compatible with the third one that you so beautifully construct? So now to the third one, the kenosis grounded solidarity model, space making for the different other. I love this model, and I love that it is based on a shared action. So being sensitive to the entailments of essentialism, if we focused on a shared feature or experience. But do we have to name what the solidarity is based on? What if we do not name it? What do we not name what is common with this kind of specificity? Leave it queer. Can we do that? What are the gains or the losses if we attempt that? How about we import from a different era the notion of the medieval haxeity, this thisness, which we leave underdefined because we can't. It transcends our epistemic access. And so we accept it's a difference, but we don't need, we accept that each human being has her own, or their own uniqueness, unicity, and we leave it at that. Can we build a solidarity in that way? How about based on love?
Thanks so much for diving so deep into the models that I've drawn up and asking these questions. And I hope I'm not sure if I'll do justice to all of them, but I'll start. Um, so first, can the first model still be useful where we're, even as we're constituted through a negation? I think it can still be immensely useful. And I think, I mean, people have actually, I think that's the model that people have celebrated most in part, as at least the type of political theologians that I hang out with most is like, that's typically the thing we lift up, right? Like, part is so useful for ideology critique. Um, and not only that, but in where only all Poland, right? Like, and politics, and I think from like early feminists understanding that the war, colonial and human or so colonial reality and of course I would say black girls, right? That's it being like heresies as fun that shouldn't be a foundation based well on and under and political poor as and we have a really of course. Um um Better. Insofar as we have many theories that somehow um, point to such negative structures of self-constitution, um, I think it has still a lot of descriptive value and provides a certain kind of relief. So if we assume that there's something like some sort of that dynamic will always happen, then is not that a promising model? And to say, right, actually, this is what theology kind of recognizes and navigates. And I think the negative type of solidarity that that the theological otherization here then offers, right? There is only one holy other, and even as that relationship is somewhat antagonistic, then it unites us in our fallenness, in our sinfulness, in whatever form, under a negative, right? Grounded on a negative, as Barth says, and on the basis of which, like that has strong equalizing power and has strong um, democratizing power, and has been used as a basis to argue for equality and even positively argue for human rights. So that is lots of value. And there have for decades and decades been like all these criticisms of like, how problematic is it that this model retains the structure of this thought and all the violence that attends it? Um, does that, I mean, in relation to Barth, right? Like, does that make Barth ultimately still a totalitarian thinker? Right? These debates have been rehashed and rehashed time and again. And I think it has to do with this, with the question, what do we do with the fact that the structure itself is reified, even as it is kind of projected somewhere else? Um, yeah, in relation to your question about homosociality, that is, why is the competition necessary? That is a wonderful question, and let's hope that it isn't. And in fact, Sedgwick's book is 30 years old probably now, and there has been not just theoretical but also empirical work that says not all homosociality works in such an competitive way. In fact, there are also wonderful modes of it that can be celebrated, and that might actually not fall into this mode. I think the fact that it plays out that way has to do with the question of whether we have what is have been called hegemonic masculinity, um, asserting itself as a structure to which everyone has to relate in some way, a kind of aspirational image of what it means to be male, or in this case, fully human. Right? Is there an aspirational model of what it means to be human? And then wherever we are, we're kind of positioned in distance to that ideal, on some sort of a spectrum of emasculation or dehumanization. And if that uh, is at play, then I think, and I mean, the question is whether some sort of gender binary will always lead to such a dynamic. And I want to ask whether some form of investment in the category of humanity will always lead to such a dynamic. But that is maybe a larger question. Yes, but there are obviously wonderful forms of brotherhood that should be celebrated, and bromance and whatever. Um, and in relation to the third model, you asked, do we have to name what solidarity is based on? I think we don't. I mean, I think what I tried to say is actually we don't. That whatever it is can be identified um, indexically, right, in the situation that we're in, rather than having preconceived categories of what needs to qualify to achieve something like solidarity. Obviously, there is then there can be kind of contextual value and limited strategic essentialism, as long as, and I think maybe this is also your pointer to Haxady, as long as we complement it by a kind of strategic de-essentialism. But all of that cannot be like that's abstract. Very, the negotiation will obviously be much more complex in the setting itself. Um, I like the idea of basing that negotiation on love, I also want to see that what that means more concretely, right? Because I that can also become kind of a romantic structure in some way that I'm always suspicious of. But that's also a larger question. Thanks.